Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another book review from the HorrorLand series, and it's book number 18, Slappy New Year. Now, off the bat, when I started getting back into Goosebumps in late 2020, I was doing some research on some of these newer Slappy books that I saw that had been coming out, just to see if these new Slappy books were any good, because as a kid I was not a fan of the Slappy books all that much. I maybe liked Bride of the Living Dummy. It was in my top 5 favorites, but everything else just didn't do it for me. And I came across some opinions about this book, and it seemed to be pretty divided. Some people really hated it. Some people said it was one of the worst Slappy books. And then some people were kind of middle of the road with it. Thought it was okay. And then some people thought it was good. Very in tune with the first 3 Night of the Living Dummy books. And after reading this, I will say that I agree with the latter of those statements. I think that this is very much in tune with the Night of the Living Dummy trilogy of books from the original 62. And I don't really think this is a bad book. And I'll get into why near the end of the video. I do think this book is a little bit overhated and kind of overconflated with a few things from some criticisms I've heard about it in the past. But I won't say that it's a stellar book. I won't say that it's something remarkable. It's very average in a lot of ways, and I'll explain why near the end. But I'd probably recommend this to people if they haven't read it before we go any further. If this was your first Slappy book ever, and let's say you're a new reader, this would be great to start with, because you really don't need to know the other books to enjoy this. Now, if you read the other books that came before this one, before you read this one might infuriate you in a couple of ways. And I totally would understand, and it kind of makes me upset too, but as a first one, I don't think you can go wrong here. So let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So the story starts off with this kid named Ray Gordon and his brother Brandon are venturing through the HorrorLand theme park. And Ray, in his monologue, is saying that he likes to tease his younger brother, who's 3 years younger than him and also taller and bigger than him, because he's scared of everything. And being in HorrorLand on vacation before the holidays means a lot to Ray, because he's into horror movies and scary things, and he's not really fazed by much. But Brandon, on the other hand, is pretty much despondent of being there, and he wants to leave as soon as possible. And Ray's having fun with him in the park, and they're walking around trying to find some attractions to do, and Ray stumbles across a horror, and he asks the horror what can they do that's actually scary, and the horrors lead them over to this test track where they get to drive real cars, and when they drive the cars, they really don't have much control over it, and every time they hit a guardrail or something, there's like a shock that comes with it. And Ray and Brandon are pretty much subjected to these shock cars at first, and once the ride is over, Ray pulls a prank on Brandon, saying, "Oh, the shock has got me," and it's just a thing to pretty much piss off Brandon, and Brandon gets upset with him. And then Ray's like, "Come on, let's go do something else. Let's go do something more scarier than this." So they find another horror, and the horror directs them over to this mirror maze of sorts. And the guy has a really funny name. I forget his name, but it was hilarious. And he has like a mirror for a face and mirrored hands, and he sends him over to the Hall of Mirrors. Now, this part of the story was really fun to me because it's a love letter to one of the original 62 books called Let's Get Invisible. So the brothers end up going inside of the Hall of Mirrors. It's pitch black in there. And then all of a sudden these bright lights turn on, and they start seeing these visions in these mirrors. And they can't see each other when they're right next to each other, and the reflections look decayed and disformed. And when they check out their own bodies, they become invisible. And it's very much like the mirror dimension people from Let's Get Invisible. And I thought that was really neat. And once they figure out that the attraction's almost over, they end up getting out after they turn back from being invisible. And they confront the horror, And the horror's like, oh, that wasn't supposed to happen. Here, take me back into the ride and show me what was wrong. And the kids decide to just bolt for it and get out of Dodge. And after they ran to pretty much the center of the park, and they end up at this souvenir shop called, I think it's called Chiller House, where all these weird items throughout the Goosebumps universe are collected and sold to kids who venture to HorrorLand. And when the two brothers enter the shop, Ray sees Slappy the dummy on a counter, and he's mesmerized by him, and he's revealed that he wants to start collecting dummies. And he mentions that he has this collecting hobby where he collects a bunch of different things. I can totally relate to him on that. I kind of plug myself into Ray and parts of the story with this. But he wants to start collecting dummies, so he asks for Slappy and wants to buy Slappy. But Jonathan Chiller, the person who runs the shop, says, you can pay me next time you come. And Ray doesn't know what to think about it, but he's happy nonetheless. He gets to take home Slappy. Now, immediately Brandon's caught off guard and wants Ray to get rid of the dummy because he's kind of afraid of it. And he pretty much begs him to get rid of it, but Ray doesn't want to. And there's this thing that pops up where as they're walking back to their hotel, they think that they hear something come out of Slappy's mouth, but it never really gets explained. So it cuts to part 2 after this when they leave HorrorLand, and Ray catches the reader up to speed that he's upset with his brother Brandon as it's getting near the holidays because Brandon made such a fit about him getting Slappy that they had to leave their vacation a few days early and come home. And Ray is really upset with Brandon over his complaining about this. So he's looking for ways to get back at him. Meanwhile, he's also concentrated on this New Year's party that he's throwing with his best friend. And him and his best friend are pretty much linked by their parents being best friends themselves for over 20 years. And this is like the penultimate thing that they want to do for this year, because historically where they live, every year around New Year's, the kids always get left behind by the parents just to watch the ball drop on TV. And they want to do something special and make New Year something special for everyone. So Ray's fixated on that. But Brandon tries to plead with Ray to get rid of the dummy before the holidays. And that way, Brandon doesn't have to be afraid. And Ray doesn't have to suffer the consequences that can potentially come from owning Slappy. Well, there comes a point where one night, Brandon is making some homemade wrapping paper, and Ray's friend is over, and they're examining what's with Slappy. There was a horror doll that Chiller gave with Slappy, and his friend was checking that out, and then his friend found a note inside of Slappy's shirt pocket and started reading the message on the card, but didn't read it fully. And she couldn't finish it because she had to leave, right? So after that happens, let's just say that Brandon has something happen in his room where all this homemade wrapping paper that he's making with paint and stuff gets essentially ruined. And Slappy is found in the room. And, of course, Ray gets blamed for it by his parents, and Ray is dumbfounded and thinks that the card in Slappy's pocket had something to do with this, because he was told by Jonathan Chiller that Slappy's a special dummy, right? And then on the card inside of Slappy's pocket, it also mentioned that if you read the spell, Slappy will come to life. And he's now suspicious that Slappy might actually be alive. But he realizes that the spell wasn't fully read, right? So he gets in trouble, and the story carries on to another point where he's hanging out with his friend again. And so him and his friend are chatting about, setting up the basement for their party when they get called back upstairs to eat some breakfast. And while eating breakfast, him and his friend, I think her name is Liana now thinking about it, are just having, a fine breakfast, and Brandon's there, just observing, being upset with Ray that he hasn't got rid of Slappy yet. And after breakfast, they start to go back down to the basement to keep working, but they hear a scream coming from Brandon's room. And they go to check it out, and maple syrup from their pancake breakfast was smeared all over his clothes, and they see Slappy in the corner, presumably involved with this again. And this time, Brandon gets Ray in a lot more trouble than before, where now the party is going to be temporarily canceled because Ray can't seem to stop pulling these pranks on Brandon. And Ray and his friend Liana have to beg their, Ray's mom to let them get another chance to do the party. And the mom is like, all right, well, you get one more chance. And if you blow this, you're not going to be able to have the party. Well, it fast forwards to another event where Ray is having a sleepless night, worried that the spell that he read might have affected Slappy. And there's another point where he himself tries to finish the spell, and he pretty much gets called down to, beforehand, I think this happened before, where he was trying to finish the spell that Liana had started, but he couldn't get the last word out of it before his dad called him. So he's thinking about it, and he's like, well, I didn't say the whole spell, but somehow Slappy's come to life. Something's not adding up. Well, in a sleepless night, he catches his brother breaking into his room, trying to get Slappy out of his closet. And essentially, Ray's so irate with Brandon that Brandon would go through all this trouble to get him in trouble and jeopardize the New Year's party, that when Brandon comes clean, Ray decides to read the full spell and bring Slappy to life in order to punish him for doing all this, just because he's afraid of Slappy. Well, after reading the spell, Slappy doesn't really come back to life, and he just lays limp, and Brandon's laughing. He's like, well, I'm no longer afraid of this thing because the spell apparently doesn't work. Well, the next day comes and goes, and they're supposed to be going to this Christmas party at Liana's family's house, I guess to exchange presents. And it's snowing outside, and they're walking to Liana's house, who only lives a couple doors down, to deliver some presents. And unbeknownst to them, Slappy had followed them. And since Slappy had followed them, there wasn't anything the kids can do to explain to the parents that they didn't bring Slappy, so Slappy had to come inside during the Christmas get-together. And Liana's dad and mom wants to see what Ray can do with Slappy. So, of course, like in typical Living Dummy story fashion, Ray tries to show off Slappy, and Slappy is just delivering some brutal jokes to everyone around them. And it's making everybody upset. And as Slappy keeps making these jokes, everyone gets more uncomfortable and wants Ray to stop. But Ray's pleading with him and saying, I'm not saying any of this. I'm not saying any of this. And Slappy starts to entangle around his arm, and he gets panicky and starts trying to shake him off, and accidentally hits his dad and knocks him to the floor. Everybody gets frantic, and he gets somehow wrapped up into Liana's Christmas tree, knocks it down, breaks all the ornaments, and pretty much ruins the Christmas get-together. And Liana's parents tells Ray's family just to go home, and everybody's shooken up. And Ray's parents are now more angry with him than ever. And he's essentially grounded for the meantime and banned from playing with Slappy. So Slappy's put down in the garage, and Ray is grounded. And he doesn't know what else to do except to apologize to his family. And since he's grounded and the party is canceled officially now, and now his own best friend won't talk to him, Ray starts to kind of simmer down on his ways of wanting to prank his brother, and he starts to kind of self-reflect and realizes that he doesn't want to get into any more trouble. So when his dad asks him to go shovel the driveway outside because it keeps on like snowing throughout the whole book, he goes out there, but his brother Brandon accompanies him to help. And while they're shoveling, they don't really talk to each other, but they kind of exchange glances, and Brandon and Ray understand that Slappy is inside the garage, and Ray has alluded to Brandon, saying that, hey, you know that Slappy came to life with that car. You got to help me here. So Brandon opens up the garage door. You know, he wants to be the first one to kind of show that he's brave because they've made New Year's resolutions, which is a part of the story where the characters kind of promise to be better. And on Brandon's resolution, his top one was to be braver because he's such a wimp, right? So he opens the door, and Slappy comes out with hedge clippers. And it's so much fun. And Slappy wants to give him a haircut, and he's upset that he got locked in the cold inside of the garage. And the boys just have to deal with Slappy in the moment. And they get this bright idea to handle him when there's a garbage truck driving by. There's this whole escapade where they think they got rid of Slappy by essentially throwing him into a garbage truck and hopes that his body was crushed by all the garbage inside of it. So, after doing that, Ray goes on a string of apologies. He apologizes to Liana, apologizes to her family, and begs his parents to let the party happen for New Year's. And the two manage to convince it to happen, so they finish setting up the basement for the New Year's party. And all the kids that they wanted to come end up coming, and they're having fun down in the basement, having a good old time. And the parents step out for a minute to go say hi to some neighbors to celebrate New Year's. And Slappy comes out of nowhere, and this is where the climax of the story happens. And Slappy goes through a tear inside of the basement, which has all these paint cans laying around, and he gets pretty violent, let's just say that. And he's making some really big threats. And there's some pretty grueling descriptions of kids like falling and smacking their heads on concrete and screaming bloody murder and being just terrorized by Slappy here. And that's all fine and dandy until you get to the resolution of the climax, where essentially Liana, Ray, and Brandon get together and think of a plan to get rid of Slappy. And this plan may work. And it involves the card that brings Slappy to life, and that's all I'll say. So the story kind of wraps up there. The aftermath kind of ensues and follows, where Ray's mom is mortified, and so is the dad at first, but the kids are strangely not in trouble because they say that the party just got out of hand and kids were just having so much fun that the paint just knocked all over the place, essentially. So the dad's like, okay, well, you just help me clean this up and nobody's going to get in trouble. The next day comes, and the dad's actually happy that the basement's painted the way it is and thinks he might keep it the way it is. He just wants all the paint cans picked up and everything. And Ray and Brandon are relieved, and they seem like they've grown closer from, you know, the whole ordeal with Slappy. Well, there's a twist involved with the mom and what she did with Slappy, and that leads to the finale of the book, the epilogue, where Ray goes up to his room frantic, thinking that Slappy has somehow made it out through this. And there's something on his bookshelf that came with Slappy, like I mentioned before, the horror ends up lighting up, and something becomes of that with Ray. And Ray may or may not end up back in HorrorLand, and there's some sinister things to be said about that. And that's essentially where the book leaves off, and that's Slappy New Year in a nutshell. So, for starters, I want to start off with some positives, because I do have a lot of positives with this book. The one thing I think I really enjoy is the opening to this book really had me. I think the HorrorLand bits in this were excellent. Whether we're talking the shocker cars or the Hall of Mirror homage to Let's Get Invisible, that stuff was awesome. That was genuinely good. So hats off to Stein for that. I really dug, for this being, let's be honest, this is a blatant rehash of Night of the Living Dummy 1, 2, and 3, and even Bride to an extent. It's like if you put all those three into a blender, that's essentially this book. But I do like the concept that Stein put in here, where the kids don't finish the spell, and that carries over to the second half of the book. To me, if you're going to do this half of the book reset and all these dummy sequels, having this helps it so it doesn't make all the points before it feel like for nothing. That was my main complaint with Dummy 3. I feel like this twist should have been in that book to make that book less irritating at the halfway point. Here, I think it flows better doing that, and I like that twist angle to it. Another thing I liked here is Slappy. I think Slappy here, even though the Slappy I enjoy is like Dummy 2 and Son of Slappy, where he's more mind-gamey and he's more cerebral. But here, he is more of like the Mr. Wood knockoff that we saw in Bride of the Living Dummy and Revenge of the Living Dummy. He's more like Mr. Wood than Slappy to me. But the stuff he does here is excellent. Like, the hedge clipper stuff was awesome. That was brutal. The descriptions of him going into the garbage compactor was awesome. And even the climax and the stuff he does to the kids in the basement, it's kind of like Bride of the Living Dummy, but not as hokey, because in Bride of the Living Dummy, the climax at the party was very much like the stuff Mr. Wood did, like barfing on people and stuff. Here, it's way different. He's like throwing paint cans. He actually has some sinister quips to him. He's very violent. I dig this. I dig Slappy here. If you're going to have this type of Slappy, this is the best version of the Mr. Wood clone Slappy that I've read so far. So, yeah, that's a good thing. I think the ending was a cool way to tie back to HorrorLand from the beginning of the story. Even though the climax was a little bit, you know, how it resolved was a little bit left to be desired, but the ending was very creepy and it makes me want to read the next book. Like, I'm genuinely hooked here. And I guess this is kind of a positive and a negative, but Ray and Brandon started off really annoying pretty much throughout the first half of the book. They were annoying. And Ray was really mean. Like, it was hard to get behind him. But after that halfway point, the two started to kind of develop a little bit. And I think once Brandon came clean to Ray about what he was doing, the two were able to grow a little bit. And I'm not saying that they grow all the way here. I mean, the believability here is about as thin as, I don't know, dental floss. But there is some development where Ray stoops in his while he's grounded and realizes that, you know, he has to be the bigger person. And Brandon comes around and, you know, takes Ray's suggestion and actually tries to be better. And I think the whole, I didn't really mention in the plot that much, but the New Year's resolution bit kind of plays into these characters wanting to do better. And while it's not completely fleshed out the best way that they've come around a little bit, they do appear so. And I can appreciate that. But, like I said, going into the negatives, the first half of the book was really rough dealing with Ray and Brandon. They were kind of annoying, and Ray was awful. I'm gonna be honest. And it made that first half of the book kind of a slog to get through. It had its fun moments at the HorrorLand part, but once it starts part 2, and you cut back to the house, until that page 70 or so reveal with Brandon, that's just textbook, boring, dummy stuff, and it's mean-spirited, and it's, let's be honest, it's not that good. Another negative I have with it is the atmosphere of the book. For it being a holiday-centered focus story, you would think that Stein would put a lot of effort into the Prouse, where you can examine, you know, the wintry weather outside, or some winter decorations, like Christmas, or Hanukkah, or, you know, any type of winter, December holiday, right? None of that was in here. The atmosphere was very minimal. A lot of the book spent its focus inside of the house, not really talking about the holidays. And for it being a New Year's themed book, I would think they would have done more than just talking about decorations of putting it in the basement and stuff. It was kind of disappointing on that front. Another thing that I think was a missed opportunity is, for this being a book set in the HorrorLand series in Arc 2, from what I've gathered, I wish that Slappy, there was more to Slappy while we were in HorrorLand, or the story ends up going back to Horrorland for like a New Year's party or something. I wish we had a Slappy-centered story where he utilizes Horrorland to do his mischief. And the reason why I say that is because I'm a massive fan of the live-on-stage story of what I call Slappy's Carnival, where he essentially is in this random carnival in the story, and he has his way with these kids and the main characters going throughout all these different mini-stories in the play. But what he does in that story was great. You know, he has his own little fun house, doing all that. I thought that that's what this book would have been. But it just wasn't. It just, like I said, it feels like the first 3 Night of the Living Dummy books and Bride put into a blender, and all those plot points get touched on from all of those books in here. And I'm not kidding. And it just, the originality doesn't show through, and, you know, it just disappoints me, right? And the originality is a problem in itself. I mean, let's be honest, this book is kind of suffering from it, but it does have its unique angles to it that are slightly different from the other books, or you can consider them tweaks. But those things do add up and are kind of enough to make me say that the originality issue isn't the biggest thing going against it. And the last issue I have really is, in the climax, the resolution, how they defeat Slappy. I don't really want to spoil it, but it involves the card that brings Slappy to life, right? And all I'm going to say is this. In the previous books before it, the card that brings Slappy to life, when it's read, it only brings them to life. It cannot put them to sleep, historically. And let's just say, in this book, it implies that the card also can put them to sleep too. And I just think that's bogus. I just think that's bogus and kind of lazy on Stein's part. I know that some people are totally against continuity and Goosebumps and stuff, but when it comes to something that simple, that's been prevalent in every single book before this, and you just throw it away like that, it comes off goofy. It comes off goofy, and I don't like it. I just think it's lazy. And, yeah. But other than that, is this book overhated? Sure. Is it great? No. But I do think it's kind of in that C tier of Goosebumps books. It has a lot of C tier issues, and for the issues I did mention, they were all kind of small to medium hitting ones, and they did add up, but from 0 to 5 stars, I was thinking like a low C for this. Now, I was on the fence between like a 3.5 to a 3.7, but I decided on the lower end of that because of the originality and the laziness of the resolution of the climax. If those were a little bit better, I would say that this book is better than Bride of the Living Dummy. But it just has a little more issues than that book did. But it's not too far off from that, or even Dummy 3 for that matter for me. So I think I'd give this book a 3.5 out of 5 and deduct 1.5 points off the top for those issues. It's a C-. It's pretty average, fine, but it's a light good. I would say decent, right? But I would recommend this for people if you haven't tried it. Like I said, if you haven't read a single Slappy book before, this might be a good first book. But if you decide to read in order, those issues I said probably will be prevalent to you. But I digress. So that's my thoughts about Slappy New Year. Let me know down in the comment section. Did you love this or did you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.